everyone to today's webinar, Making Your Story Matter More, Positioning Challenging Social Issues for Maximum Engagement. My name is Natasha. I'm the Community Animator for Vibrant Communities Canada, and I'd like to introduce Lindsay Sage and Jeff Sage today. So Lindsay is the co-founder and senior strategist of sagecomm. Her passions are strategy and storytelling. She focuses on the facilitation of strategic plans, solutions, and stories that build powerful, authentic brands. Lindsay takes great pride in sagecomm's long-term client relationships and community partnerships. She is energized by helping their clients create powerful narratives to build connections to audiences and communities in new and remarkable ways. And to the right of your screen, you'll also see Jeff Sage. He is also a co-founder and senior strategist of sagecomm. Jeff's role as senior sagecomm strategist combines his expertise in marketing and public relations with his passions for all things digital. Jeff loves to push limits, ask provoking questions, and encourages everyone to see things through different lenses. His secret sauce is his deep passion for causes and community. He also writes stunning ad copy, has a healthy disdain for the status quo, and penchant for justice. So welcome, Jeff and Lindsay, and thank you for joining us on today's broadcast.
Hello. Great to be here. Thank you very much for having us. Okay, so we are very excited to be on with you today. We are huge fans of the work that you do, and we know how important it is for building capacity in communities, because we have the pleasure of working with a lot of causes and issues, charity, nonprofit, and otherwise, across North America. So we appreciate very much the work that you do. We have quite a bit that we want to go through because, you know, marketing people like to talk a lot. So we're going to do our best to get through everything in a short period of time. So we have lots of time for interaction and questions. So we may speed through a little bit, but we are looking forward to talking with all of you after we're done with the slides. So here's what we want to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about the global context, you know, what's going on in the world, what is positioning, how to do it well, why you should care about it, talk about audience, talk about creating a great story, show you some examples of some positioning work we've done in action so you can see how these things translate in the real world, and going to leave off with some sort of practical tips and tricks. So to dive right in, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff for some global context.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. I'll dive right in. So I'm going to make an assumption that if you're here today listening to this, you've probably felt a little bit like this over the past 24 months. There's been a lot of change and a lot of uncertainty. And I think in large part that's because the art of getting attention has changed. Attention for your social, your web, your news releases, your passion projects, your work in general, attention for it is scarce. And it's scarce because our attention doesn't scale. We can't make more of it. We can't do more than one thing at a time. And all the parents joining us today will probably get that very well. And competition for our attention is now growing day by day. Because today we're going through the largest increase in expressive capability ever in human history. Clay Shirky said that about 5 years ago, and it's probably more true today than ever. In 2000, about 16 years ago, there was about 361 million people using the internet. Today, when you woke up, there's about 3.5 billion, all competing for attention. And as Tim Berners-Lee teaches us, you know, the web is much more a social creation than it is a technical one. And the social web has had a profound impact on how modern, connected people live their lives. And we're connected to each other, the media, our peers, politicians, influencers in a whole new way. And it's really changed the game for good. More people are online, more brands, more businesses, more media equals more ideas, and more ideas equals more noise. And ideas and noise lead to change and uncertainty. Entire industries are being disrupted, and the nonprofit and social issue space is not immune in any way to this shift. And that uncertainty really is because of one reason, we believe, and it's because the internet is the first medium in history, if you compare it to the telephone or to a major motion picture or any other medium. It's the first one in history to support a many-to-many conversation. And that technological advancement has changed the rules of production and consumption forever. The good news about all of this disruption is when new ideas are circulated broadly, it changes society. And that's where all of you come in. Your position, your persistence, and your consistency matter now more than ever.
Thank you, Jeff, for that context. So to build on what Jeff said, essentially if we boil that all down, talk about ideas and noise, etc., essentially everyone on this phone call has 200 things they want to tell me that are important about their cause or issue. Unfortunately, I can't hear them because there's too much noise out there, and as a human being, I actually don't have the ability to interpret that much. How many of you ever had the feeling where if I could just tell you all the things about my organization or this cause or issue, you would get it, and then you would be a supporter? Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of that. And the reason is that the latest research estimates that we're getting exposed to messages, brands, and related content about 3,000 to 5,000 messages per day or exposure. So that's, the brand of toothpaste in your bathroom, what you're seeing in your social feed when you're scanning in the morning, right down to traditional interruption style advertising. So 3,000 to 5,000 messages a day. The research also tells us that we receive probably less than 12 of those that we are actually able to understand and to internalize. That means your message better be good, right? To cut through that noise, it better be impactful, and more than anything, it has to be about quote unquote me. The me factor in society now is incredibly high. That doesn't mean we're turning into bad versions of ourselves. It just means that technology and everything that Jeff has described is increasingly developing an attention deficit and a me factor in the audience that you're trying to reach. So who cares about positioning? Well, you should, because you've got to figure out how your cause or issue or your message or organization can cut through this noise. And it's a tough task out there now for all the reasons that we've just talked about. So when we talk about positioning, what do we mean? Ultimately, if we were to boil down positioning, it would be the story you want the audience to understand and to share. So from beginning to end, everything you want them to know about the issue. Of course, you can't tell them all those things at the same time, but in order for you to tell an effective story, you have to understand what the foundation and the origin is of said story. So the foundation of great positions, as we call them, it has to speak to the audience where they are, and I don't mean physically or geographically, because that's what your marketing strategy will do, is target them specifically in mediums and channels, but where they are intellectually and emotionally on a particular issue. Should they feel a certain way about your cause? They probably should, but as human beings, we just don't have the luxury of that attention. So you need to speak to them where they are, hearts and minds wise. It should focus on the desired outcome or impact. So not about the program or service, but about, if I support this, what is this going to mean for me, for the people you help, and for our community? Not what is the journey to get there, but what does it mean? It often will organize around a romantic ideal of something, right? In an ideal state, this would happen. That has some emotional resonance with people. And then again, we're going to stress this a lot over the call. It has to have an inherent me factor. Whether we like it or not, that's the society in which we're living. In order to get attention, I have to understand that a piece of content somehow relates to me or resonates with me in a particular way. So what we're saying ultimately, this is not a nice thing to hear, especially when you're someone working really hard on an important cause or issue. Ultimately, it's all about the audience. It's really not about you at all, or it's about you last. So if we go back to that notion of 200 things, yes, you've probably got 200 wonderful things you could tell someone about your organization, but we have to earn the right to tell them those things. First, we need to tell them something about themselves. So at sagecomm, we really believe deeply and passionately in research. Sometimes it's a funny thing to try to sell to people or convince them that it's important. But if you really want to know what will resonate with your audience, the very simple way to do that, to understand that, is to ask them. So informed assumptions are great. Everyone on the call are likely subject matter experts in the sector or area or issue that you work on. But no matter what you think you know, you're making an assumption about your audience. They may be informed, but they are assumptions nonetheless. Also, research helps break down what we would call the bubble factor. So I think, and we've had this experience personally with causes and issues we're involved with our family. It's hard to believe that there isn't someone out there who would want to solve important issues, who doesn't believe in, helping vulnerable people or tackling major issues in a community or diseases, things like that. These are things that we're all incredibly passionate about, but beware the bubble factor, believing that everyone around you believes exactly what you believe because it's the right thing. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And believe when you do the research, you'll always learn something. It's incredible, the light bulbs that can come on, especially in terms of an audience, when you take the time to do the research. So here's some tips on designing a research program. It does take some time. It doesn't have to take, years upon years, but take the time. You want to take the time to do it right. So you want to design something that helps you understand your audience and how to reach them by who they are, what they care about, what dominates their giving or purchasing decisions, and you need to talk to them again where they are. So not geographically, but emotionally and intellectually. Ways to avoid biases, and we're talking about here about both quantitative and qualitative research. So for marketing, our research tends to be more qualitative in nature when we're developing positioning. So try not to pick participants who already believe what you believe. It is an awesome feeling to have someone reflect back to you what you already believe. It's because you want to believe that you're on the right track. But you need to hear from people who are outside of your immediate circle to get outside of that bubble. And then the research isn't the time to try to make people believe what you believe. It's to understand what they understand and how they possibly could be influenced to support what you're telling them. We like to involve immersion as much as possible. So in the case of a recent poverty awareness campaign we worked on, we actually took our audience, which was middle-class families, through immersions of poverty simulations. Now, that doesn't mean they get the full picture, but it's really valuable to immerse people in situations to understand their reactions to, where they're uncomfortable, how they react to things, the questions that they ask. Really, really interesting. Ask them a million questions or more if you can, if you've got them. And then the other thing is that we like to do is to capture the experience. So here are some examples of ways that we do that. You can do that through collaging exercises with your audience. You can do it through, charting a course, which you see down in the right-hand corner, charting a journey, or charting a pathway of understanding. You can also do it through capturing through video. What this allows you to do, of course, is to come back and really study what you've learned from your research. And it also can be valuable in helping, in our case, our clients or the partners that we work with. In your case, maybe people who are influencers who are making decisions in your organizations, in the value of the approach that you're taking, because you have done some research and you understand the audience as deeply as you can. So things that we've learned over the course of doing research on lots of different social issues, from housing first to violence against women to community health and vulnerable populations, audiences don't actually respond to shock or fear or discomfort. Even though there's a lot of really potent ads out there that try to shock people into attention, that certainly you get someone's attention for, maybe 10 to 15 seconds while they're taking a look at what you've presented them. But ultimately, that kind of approach will shut people down emotionally. And most of the causes and issues that you're all working with, and the ones we have the privilege of working on, have an inherent emotional factor to them that we need people to engage with. And our research really shows us that if we try to shock them or make them feel uncomfortable in particular, you should do something about this, it often tends to shut people down. It doesn't open up the conversation, it shuts it down. Information overload, can't say that enough, right? I just can't understand the 200 things, even though they may all be very valid. And then the other thing we've discovered is it's really difficult to ask someone to put yourself in another person's shoes. So we've gone into projects with assumptions saying, if we could make people understand this through our research, we can make this emotional breakthrough with them, and it's going to be this incredible, cathartic moment, and then we're all going to get it, and people are going to jump on board. But the fact of the matter is, for example, if you've never lived in poverty, I can't make you understand the depth and breadth of the challenge of that particular situation. What I can do is understand what you do know about it, how you react to that, and how I can make that relatable to you in your own life. So that's a lot of what we focus on. So what doing this for you, if you do your research, you understand your audiences, what that sets you up to do with your positioning is to translate the issue into a really great story for that desired audience. So if you think of your positioning and your research as the foundation, the storytelling is the next layer. So taking that position and knowing what you know about your audience and translating it into bite-sized pieces that your audience can understand and grab onto and really interact with. So if we talk about what makes a great story, there's lots of literature out there about this, but we've got a couple of principles that we like to focus on in terms of what's really effective in storytelling. So there's 4 main principles we want to focus on. So a great story is clear and simple. I get it easily. There is that temptation, again, to try to lop on. I'm sure you've all had the experience where you write a news release or you write a great piece of copy for the website or something else, and then someone says, hey, why don't we add this? Let's add a paragraph about this and add a picture of that and then a link to this. That's great and sometimes appropriate, especially when you've earned the right to tell the audience more. But in the case of initially telling that story, if I have to work to understand it, I'm automatically going to be going in the other direction, right? I'm going to scan past or click off, or I'm going to be shut down to get that information. So I shouldn't have to work to understand the story that you're telling me. The second one is that it actually has some impact or demonstrates results. Another way to describe that would be it talks about outcome, right? It's not about the 50 important programs and services, and often at the beginning it's not necessarily about the particular statistics, but what are the stories around the impact? What's the impact to some individuals that you've worked with? So, we work a lot with the YMCA, and they have a wonderful thing that they call why stories. They never start a meeting without a why story, and it's always a story of impact, right? The story about the impact of the YMCA on an individual life or a family. So you should be able to demonstrate results. Third, it is personal and emotional, so I can make a connection to it. Jeff and I have 2 children, so causes that involve kids, automatically, if the story is told well, will get my attention. There has to be something that relates to me personally and emotionally for me to have, and I say me as the global me, your audience, to really make a connection with your story. Facts are great, logic is great, but as human beings, we're most attracted to something that has emotional resonance for us. So that's another key piece, is that connection. And then fourth, it inspires action. So what do you want them to do now? Let's assume that you have this great story, it made an impression on someone, and they're ready to do something. Don't leave them hanging at that moment. So there's a lot of really great awareness campaigns out there and stories that we hear all the time. We hear the story of impact and think, oh my goodness, that is the most amazing story I've ever heard. It was easy to understand. I understand how where there was the impact. It connected with me. What can I do now? And the answer often isn't there. It's just, oh, be aware of this. This is happening. Well, while you've got me in that moment, ask me to do something. If you want to inspire me to take another step towards the issue. So what do you want me to do now? So I'm going to show you 2 examples that we worked on with our friends from the YMCA. So here's a story of this young man. I rarely can tell this story without crying, but it's a great story of the impact of camp on a child. So these are examples of fundraising pieces that Y used on a social campaign, mostly Facebook. So you're telling a story. The target of this was to tell a story to moms who you want to donate to the Strong Kids Fund for camp. This is essentially a story of a young man who went to school, struggled, couldn't make any friends the entire year, ultimately made his way to a Y camp, and his mother called the camp director that later November to say she was packing his bag to go for his very first sleepover because he'd made enough, got enough language skills and made friends and got enough confidence to make friends in school that next year. So there's not a mother in the world that can hear that story and not want to offer that experience to another child and not want to be able to relate to it. That campaign did very well. Similarly, the CQE refers to Camp Queen Elizabeth in Honey Harbour, Ontario, where the Y has their residential camp. So 2 weeks at CQA can change a life. I gave you a child broken by bullying. You built her back up. So you can imagine there's an enormous backstory there. We're not telling that backstory. We're not telling the 200 things. We're not talking about camp programs and services. We're not talking about the fun, strong kids that allows kids to go to camp. What we're talking about is just telling a great story that makes a connection with mom so she'll consider donating and or sharing the story with her friends. Okay? So I want to give you an idea of, obviously there's a ton of stuff under this topic, so we're just covering the surface of it. We're going to give you a sense of how we typically approach an issue campaign that might help inform for you how you might approach it as well. We focus on 3 phases in a campaign: awareness, education, and action. So make people aware that something is happening. Give them some education on why they should care about this particular thing, making it personal and emotional and resonant to them, and then invite them to take some kind of action. So once you've got a bit of a groundswell of support, don't let it hang there. Ask them to do something now that they're inspired to do it. Now, this seems simple. 3 easy steps, and there you go. This actually can take an incredibly long time, especially when you are dealing with a complex issue, and I'm sure many of you deal with very complex issues. So here is more of a broken down, simplified version of that. So to undertake a campaign like this, you want to discover and understand and scope the issue as much as you can, define it really clearly, and do your research in the way that we talked about in all the ways that make sense. Then you would build personas, as we call them. That's a marketing jargon term for developing profiles of our audience. So really deeply understanding, let's say, mom, professional mom between the ages of 35 to 45 is your target audience. You want to do as much as you can to actually build a character, in a sense, that is mom, and really understand what you know from her about research, and understand her motivations, understand how you can reach her, understand that she's very busy, so you've got to have a great story to cut through the noise that she's dealing with, and build a persona around that, because that allows you to actually come back later and test. Did we meet the mark here for mom, given everything we know about her? Is this message going to work? And if not, you want to go back to the drawing board on that. So define your position, as we've talked about. Once you define your position, you got to simplify it. You probably want to simplify it again and simplify it one more time, because there is such thing as being too close to something, where it's hard to see what the most important facts are. Your personas and your research should help with that, but always err on the side of simplification. Make it into a story, storify it in various pieces, and I'll show you some examples of how we've done that in past campaigns. Then you want to test it with your target audience again, the people you did the research with or people like them. You don't want to test it with everyone in your office necessarily, because everyone in your office is going to think it's great because it's about the issue, right? So that's not necessarily an objective view, even though it's tempting to show it to other people who believe what you believe. And then you want to build champions. In our case, we've had the opportunity to work with some amazing committees in some of the work that we've done. Some of them are community committees, sometimes they're internal community committees in an organization. But it's nice to have that front line of champions who can help in the initial stages of a campaign to spread the word. Then, of course, you deliver your message, and I'm going to show you a plan by which we've done that in the past. And then you want to repeat. So it's tempting to, if something's really working well, it's tempting to want to build on it some more. Okay, let's tell them now these things and these things and these things. For the awareness and education phase of a campaign to be really effective, you've really got to say the same thing over and over as much as you can. Research a couple of years ago said someone has to hear something 7 times in order for them to take an action or really understand it. I think that number has probably grown to about 10 or 12 times now. And as the number of repetitions grows, our attention gets actually less. Our attention spans are going down. And then measure, always measure your work, build into the plan that you can measure that work so you can go back and say, this campaign was valuable and let me show you how. Here's why we should invest in awareness. And then continue that investment. Because sometimes what we find, it's great, you have a conversation, say, we really need an awareness campaign. Let's get a great awareness campaign. You have a wonderful awareness campaign. It goes on for 6, 12, 18 months, just depending on the scope. And then everyone says, oh, okay, that's done. Off we go to something else. And then 2 years later, you're back in the position of saying, oh, you know what we need? We need an awareness campaign. So what you want to do is, if you can afford it, build in something to continue to sustain the investment so all that goodwill and all that community knowledge you've built doesn't get lost. Okay, so here's an example of something that we worked on recently and how the phases were delivered. So you've got your research phase, of course, the positioning phase, getting into writing the strategy. How do we actually deliver this? And every conceivable channel, from traditional advertisements to follow ads to billboards to ads that end up shown to you on your weather network app when you look at it in the morning. So looking at multi-channel based on your audience, and then that awareness, education, and action. Ultimately, at the end of this, we want to provide opportunities for the audience to take the next step within their comfort and ability to do their own part to address whatever that issue is. So I'm going to show you some of this positioning in practice, and then we're almost done, just a few more minutes, and we'll get into taking some questions and having some conversation. So 3 different campaigns: literacy, violence against women, and poverty and social inclusion. So I want to show you the position, and then I'm going to show you just a couple of examples about how the position was delivered. Again, we're just scratching the surface of the campaign, but I want to show it to you in action. So this is a literacy campaign out of London, the Child and Youth Network here. It's a wonderful organization to work with. They really get this stuff really well and are passionate about it. The position of this really is that every child is born with potential. Achieving it starts with words. And you'll see the art in a minute. But what this is based on, fundamentally, if you boil it down to the audience, is their belief for parents. From the first moment you look into the little eyes of your child, you want them to be everything they can be, and there's nothing in the world you wouldn't do to help them get there. What this campaign suggests is that actual words, literacy, in all of its forms, is the way to help your child achieve its potential, or achieve his or her potential. It doesn't talk about literacy. It talks about the outcome. What parent doesn't want their child to race them to school every day, to know that they're loved and secure? And children who won't be bothered by bullying, who will change the way the world sees issues like gender equality. Okay, next example. This is from Violence Against Women, a capital campaign that helped raise over $1 million in one of the most depressed regions of Canada, economically depressed. So the position was, this is an invitation to the community to create more space for safety, dignity, and for healing. This is a difficult issue for people to get their hands around. No one wants to admit that it's something they understand or someone they may know who's experiencing this, unfortunately. But ultimately, what's the position? That everyone deserves to have a safe and secure and peaceful night's sleep. And what this new shelter can provide is the best night's sleep they've had in years. That's something we can all relate to. So here's an example of how that shook out into some creative. So telling the story of the outcomes, joy and play, no matter how old people are, no falling behind in school, and every family to have a room of their own in the shelter if they needed it. And then the third one, this is a poverty awareness campaign out of London. So for community to be truly great, it has to be great for everyone. Yeah, intellectually I can understand that position, but emotionally, what's at the heart of that? You don't want to be left out, and neither does anyone else. So while I, the audience, may not be able to relate to the experience of experiencing severe poverty or homelessness or the many, many terrible challenges that come along with that, I can understand the concept of social exclusion and not being included. That's a relatable concept to everyone. So that's what the campaign is based on. And then a couple of different examples. These were teaser cards that were done to try to contextualize. What does it mean to be excluded? It's invisibility. It's being overlooked. It's trying to contextualize it in that way. And then here's a graphic that actually played very well in the market that was popular, so people could actually understand. We have a stadium here in London called Budweiser Gardens that seats about 9,500 people. So 7 times that. People who are vulnerable and experiencing poverty in our community could fill that place 7 times over. So that's the context. So last bit here, I'm just going to do a couple do's and don'ts. We have about 100 of these. We had to choose a couple, but we look forward to talking more about them. So do take the time to really get the issue. Often when you have an awareness campaign, something's on fire. When someone says we need an awareness campaign, often something is on fire, right? And you need to boost that awareness. But do, if you can, take the time to understand your audience and understand your issue, because it's going to pay dividends for you ultimately, rather than rushing a campaign to market that feels good internally, but maybe doesn't make the mark outside. We would encourage engaging as much as you can people with lived experience in the issues that you're working on. We've had that opportunity in the last couple of years with some projects we work on, and that has been absolutely invaluable. Talking like dramatically changing the outcome and the potency of projects because we had the right consultants on the project with us. Can't say enough about that. Realize it's not about you at all. I know you don't want to, no one wants to hear that, but it's not about your organization. It's not about the programs and services you offer. It's really about the audience themselves and how you can engage them. So you want to earn the right to tell them more. So you can't tell them 200 things. You need to focus on something that's going to resonate in the ways that all the ways great stories can, and not those 200 things that they can't internalize. Focus on the outcome, I've already referred to. Don't expect your audience to suddenly get it. There isn't necessarily that emotional, wonderful breakthrough moment where everybody gets it and we all ride into the sunset together, you know, kicking the butt of some issue. It's a long process, and I won't necessarily ever get it as a member of your audience, but I will get how I can relate to it and how I can be a part of the solution. Don't cram in the 200 things. You've already heard that, but talk about repetition of message. You can't say it enough. It's really, really important. People just can't hear all the things you want to tell them. You've got to earn the right to tell them more. Don't create issue porn. I hope you'll excuse the expression. It's an expression that one of our clients has used, and we think it's really effective. Where some campaigns where we can go into that shock or discomfort phase, it doesn't do any justice to the issue, and it exploits the people we're trying to help. So just something to keep in mind. Beware of your own Kool-Aid, which is like we like to say. We get sometimes down the rabbit hole so far with causes and issues, we suddenly feel like we've solved something, and really it's just because we've been so engaged in it. Test your assumptions, your messages, your creative, etc. It's really important. Know what you stand for. This is the last few. This project that we just finished up in London here around poverty awareness. We were really passionate about it. We worked on it for a really long time, and the project went through many evolutions. So along the lines of not sort of drinking your own Kool-Aid or losing sight of who you're trying to help, we started every single meeting with this statement: to always revisit, why are we here? It's easy to get seduced by, you know, quote unquote sexy creative. So like, oh, that looks really great. It's very stunning visually. That's going to work. But you constantly got to go back to what you're trying to achieve rather than something that looks nice. You got to have something that's going to be really, really effective, especially when you're stewarding public or nonprofit dollars. And finally, this is the last one. If no one is talking about you, you're doing something wrong. This is a motto that we live by here at sagecomm. These are some controversial, difficult things that you're dealing with. People have really passionate opinions about them, and that's okay. That's important for the conversations we need to have in our communities, but it can be discouraging sometimes. So take heart that if someone is talking about you, that means they're talking about the issue. So you've achieved what you want to achieve, whether that sometimes it's negative, mostly it's positive, but if you can get more hands involved in your issues, capture more hearts, that means you have more advocates, you have more influence, and you can make more change. That's why you make this kind of investment in awareness, and it can be really, really powerful. So take heart. If no one's talking about you, then maybe you're not pushing it hard enough to the edge. And then this is just another example of when we need to help people see the things that we see. The way we can do that is through really potent positioning and persuasive narratives that speak to our audience. So we'll leave you with that. And I think Natasha's going to come back on to facilitate some questions.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. And thank you, Jeff, for sharing your lessons from your experience in London with different community organizations, and specifically helping us to put that into terms of poverty reduction and your experience with the Child and Youth Network in London that we both work closely with. Some of the big three things that I wrote down from this call were position, persistence, and consistency that you talked about at the very beginning of the webinar, but also simplification, I think, was a huge message in this webinar. So thank you for that. One of the things, and I might actually just hijack the question period while everybody is writing in their questions, I do invite you to, if you have any questions for Lindsay or Jeff, please do submit them through the questions box. But I actually had my own before we dive into it. And at first, at the beginning of the webinar, it was coming up for me. We want to minimize our jargon and don't talk about the programs and services as much, but how do we do that while still engaging people in kind of what it is we're doing and that process? But I think you talked a lot about storytelling and how we need to tell the story and talk about the outcomes with that. So my question is, how do we get from storytelling to action? Would you have any advice or recommendations on how we make that connection to go from this is our position and here's this really important thing with outcomes, and so then how do we do that call to action to others?
Sure, that's a great question, and we really do think it's important, right? It's one thing to have awareness, but once you've got people's attention, if you can get them to convert, essentially. A tactic that we've used that's pretty practical in an awareness campaign is driving people to a landing page where they can find more information. So a website, a small website. What it allows you to do is, one, you can actually track who converts to that site, right? Not that, hits to a website are the thing you want to track necessarily, but it allows you to see who converts over to the campaign. And then on that site, you want to give them tangible things to do. In one case, it might be, download this toolkit and be a part of this. In one case, we went all the way down the rabbit hole, so to speak, and actually had people take a quiz where they could find out what the best opportunities for volunteerism were for them related to an issue. But having that place where people can go for more information, even if they choose not to do anything else except visit the site, that's something you can track. You can track what they look at. You can track how long they stay. You can track if they share things. And that's a good way from a numbers perspective to track the potency of a campaign. I should also mention that any public awareness campaign that you do, if you're tracking numbers, you'll probably only see, we say, a third to a half of all of the actual engagement in a campaign. Because I can see an ad, or I can, read an article and understand it and then get on with being a part of that solution. I won't necessarily take all of the actions I could. So that doesn't tell you the full picture, but it can tell you a good piece of that is to be able to track some of those numbers through a landing page.
Mm-hmm. And just to build on that, we actually had a question about new initiatives or organizations. Do you have any suggestions on where small or new organizations should invest in order to build that awareness and support?
Yeah, I don't think it's much different from the process that Lindsay sort of has outlined when she went through the process. You want to start with really getting an understanding of your issue and doing that research. And research really, when you get the term research, people think it's about data and numbers and facts and figures, but research is about understanding and it's about empathy. And that's how the best positions are crafted, if they're rooted in empathy. And that empathy usually comes from the research phase. And so if there's an organization that's just starting out, I wouldn't change the advice that we presented here. They have to understand themselves better as they relate to other people. And that takes time and effort. But if they can achieve understanding and empathy, that's probably the best first step for any movement.
Great, thanks. And I might just bring it back to our pre-webinar questions that are more about communicating that message. Our first one was sent in, and Jeff, I understand that you're the media guru. Do you have any recommendations in terms of gaining media coverage?
Yeah, I can probably share some advice I got from an actual guru, and it was probably the first piece of advice I ever got in terms of sort of dealing with the media. And it was basically a story that this guy told me right out of school. And he basically said, here's what's going on. An editor wakes up every day with the same gigantic pain in the butt. And it's basically a big, empty, blank piece of paper. And his job every day is to fill it. And instead of sending out a news release, your job is to help them fill it. And so how do you go about doing that? If you invert sort of you wanting to get your message out to helping them fill it, things start to change. You're writing for their audience, not your perceived audience. You're writing in their format, not your format. You're working on their timelines, not your timelines. Mm-hmm. You're essentially doing their work for them, not yours. And that includes everything up to getting other experts that they can quote and making it clear why their readers should actually care. And when you go through distilling your position or your news release in that way, we found that you often get a lot more results. Results like having a series written instead of having one story written. And if you take something like that, earned media, and you align it with some planning that Lindsay went through, you start to see and feel a campaign, and that's where movements can start. And so that's probably my best advice in terms of dealing with traditional media.
We've had some great success in partnering with our local media and other media outlets around some issue campaigns, but you really got to think about when you're pitching to them. So I want you to cover this issue or this campaign. It's how do we position it in a way that's going to be attractive first to the editor and doesn't seem like a puff piece or a throwaway that you're just going to do because you're a good guy for the charitable sector, but really that is something the readers can engage with and, like Jeff said, help fill that blank page.
And new is always good, right? Like their nightmare is basically to get the same thing you sent them last year or the same event or the same person holding up a placard with a number on it. It's actually not news. And so when you look at it through that filter and try to create news about yourself, you're that much further down the path when you make your initial pitch.
Mm-hmm. And talking about positioning, this is a pre-webinar question that it's actually from a funder's perspective. But this person was asking, if you work for a funder and you'd like to communicate something maybe through a press release about a fundee's story to generate some positive press, but are challenged by the fact that that fundee feels like your communication might alienate the community or alienate the community's buy-in to their project. And so you have to revise your communication so that it's maybe less data-driven and it's not actually picked up in the end. Do you have any advice on how to approach this challenge? Have you ever encountered anything like that?
Yeah, I can sort of technically, I think you want to create a position. Essentially, as humans, as mammals, we want to make a decision emotionally first, and we make purchase decisions emotionally first. We make most of the decisions that we make emotionally first, and we like to justify those decisions with data and information. And so sometimes it's taking a funding announcement and taking the thing that you want to put out the most, which is like, hey, here's a number or a figure, and translating that, making a news story where we can have some emotional buy-in first, and then we want to justify agreeing with this type of funding based on the number last. And so it's sort of counterintuitive, but and it takes a little bit more effort, but the story tends to resonate more if you create an alternate story, and that number is part of the story, not the emotional part. The emotional transfer of an idea can't happen if I just have a piece of data. The government gave this amount of money here. There's nothing for me to organize around emotionally, and that's where narratives tend to fall flat.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, it sounds like maybe in some cases it's hard because we want to push to tell a story in a particular way, and not everybody feels comfortable with it, right? I think there's a level of discomfort, or will this bring additional scrutiny to us as an organization? We would argue, even though that it can be challenging and painful sometimes, that additional attention is a good thing, one. And I think you got to continue to ask yourself, no matter who your audience is, whether it's the newspaper editor or individual mom who you want to give to something or get involved in something, the question they're going to ask, and you should be asking on their behalf, is why should I care? So great, you've got this thing that you want me to know, but why should I care about it? That's the key question, right? In the attention economy, or the lack of attention economy, that's the question we constantly have to be answering.
And I think it kind of goes back to drinking your own Kool-Aid, where you assume that everybody has your own perspective, because you talk to so many people who share the same perspective, and we do have to open ourselves up for conversations with people who have different ideas on how we reduce poverty, or how we address mental health or addictions and that kind of thing. We actually have Paige who's asking if you have any recommendations around addressing multiple audiences. For example, if we're trying to reach out to legislators and community members and administrators, students, and et cetera.
Yeah, for sure. I think we would, I guess it sounds like we're kind of going back to the presentation, but it's kind of the fundamentals. So if you went through a research process or you have already data that will support understanding those audiences, you want to niche them out into their various groups. You have a core position, let's say. What is the position on the issue? Again, the story you want people to know from front to back, or back to front on the story, and then curate that in your storytelling for that particular audience. So government bodies or legislators probably want to hear something a little different than students, for example. And Jeff's got tons of experience in this area in education that he could talk about. But it's about having your core position and then customizing it for the audience you're trying to reach. You're not saying something radically different because you have that core position to those various audiences, but you are customizing it to them. You're making why should they care? You're answering that question for them. That's sort of the, because it should be consistent in the sense that it's grounded in something the same across the board, but then you got to think really about their motivations. Why should they care about this issue is different for, a legislator, say, than a student. I don't know if you nailed on that.
And you don't get the luxury of being able to communicate to like a dozen different groups at a time. It doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work through various mediums. So if you take, for example, someone who writes for a living, somebody like Stephen King, there are millions of people that read his prose every year, and you can imagine the daunting task of thinking of those million people and then trying to write a scary book for them, which he doesn't do. He picks one person, which is his wife, and he writes for her, and then a certain group of people who like that are his fans and people that dive into his work. And so if you're choosing, when you're writing something for somebody, if you're choosing, 8 different audiences, then you're probably doing it wrong. And you probably should be pushing out more than one communication on more than one channel that's targeting one specific audience group and maybe one subgroup. But if you push it any further than that, it's going to be tough.
It's the all the things to all the people. I think you've probably all experienced this, where you get that, let's add this, and let's add that, and let's add this. But if you can be really focused, it's going to be much more effective. Even if you're reaching less people, ultimately the message is going to be received and acted upon more readily.
And that same thing, I think, goes to committee work as well, right? Like a lot of these projects, a lot of our job was distillation and simplification. It was taking, 25 people's opinion and then convincing them that if we had all 25 opinions in there, we weren't going to move the needle at all. And it's creating something that everybody can buy into, but at the end of the day, there's only one voice, and it's going out to one group that you understand really well. And that's sort of just, you're building a horse by committee, and it usually comes out a camel because everybody gets a say in it. That's when your narrative loses its potency.
I wonder, actually, while we're on this topic, if you have any advice, specifically, what you're talking about with understanding who each of the audiences are, on engaging businesses or the private sector in what we're doing. That we have the Cities Reducing Poverty Summit coming up in April, and we're going to be focused on when businesses are engaged. So we actually had a question around how do we we reach out to the private sector? How do we reach to the business sector on things, that they might be more naturally engaged in already, such as paying a livable wage? Do you have any recommendations on how we dig into that engagement?
Absolutely, and I love this question. It's a great one, and it's so underrepresented, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why. So for example, if you're going to go out to the business community with a poverty narrative, it should be about the math and the money and taxes, and the fact that even in our local community, they've taken provincial data, mapped it over top of London, and so if we solve the homelessness problem, poverty-driven issues in London, it's tantamount to $1 billion put back into our community. It would be like dropping a second Western into our community, which would have a tremendous impact. And so it's about taking the one part of your movement that you will be able to influence a business community with, and creating a whole suite of narratives around that, and leaving the rest of the stuff that you're most passionate about behind, because it's not for them, or they don't care, or it won't work. And so there are tremendous economic arguments for the work that you're doing, and it's just about having the gumption to be able to lead with that, and have a poverty conversation about money. And about what somebody who might be really conservative will get if this problem is solved in the community. And I don't see that out anywhere, really. I see it all on sort of the other social side, and I'm guilty of that more than anybody, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity there, and I think it's just about understanding clearly what a really conservative person or somebody in business would care about, or someone who's running a business, what poverty means to them first, and then spinning a narrative that way. And I don't think it's been done well across the country in a meaningful way that we've come across. So there's a huge opportunity there.
And when you're focusing, or when you're trying to identify what that message is, we actually had a question about determining your focal point, because we're dealing with such complex issues like homelessness, addictions, mental health, poverty. Do you have any recommendations on how we determine that focal point for each of the different audiences? Or if there's maybe one focal point across all of them?
Yeah, and that's sort of where you get into distilling the research. Typically, there are key points that come out of that form the foundation of a position. But the best advice we can give there is finding that emotional aspect, but more importantly, it's about iteration. And so outside of the research, if you haven't rewritten your position outside of your foundational research, like more times than you want to share with your colleagues, then you probably haven't done it enough. That's where it's just like writing a good headline. Typically, all the best ad agencies in the world will write things over and over and over and over and over again until they polish something that actually is potent based on some research. And so a lot of the times we kind of have the research and we write something and we share it and we tweak it based on a few opinions, and then we kind of push it to the market or ship it. And I think that's where a big swath of the iterative process is left behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It really is. It sounds fundamental, but that know your audience and speak to them where they are because you've deeply understood them. So when we do positioning, we might have a 2-page position on a poverty project, let's say, but only 1/8 of that sees the light of day for a particular audience group, right? Because it's being customized for them. What is the focal point for the business community is not the same thing for our mom audience. And it's not the same thing for maybe our active Zoomer audience or an empty nester or whatever. You got to think through who your primary audiences are and then focus in on them, especially not as being 16 different audiences and 16 different messages, but one position customized for 1 to 2 key audiences.
That's where we've had some of the biggest fights we've ever had in the history of our organization with our staff. And I probably consider most of these people my family. We're a very tight-knit group, but we've had some real heated, serious debates, arguments, voices raised about positions and about research and about what is going to get probably one of the most important social issues in our country across to people. And it's probably one of the hardest narratives we've ever worked on ever to distill. And at the end of the day, unless you've been through it, it's tough to understand. And after studying it for 2 years, the only conclusion I've come to is that I don't understand it, and I probably never will. But that understanding formed the basis of how we went about trying to reach a middle-class audience about an issue like poverty. And if there's no passion, if there's no conflict during that phase, then you're probably doing it wrong.
He's not kidding, by the way. He got chased around the boardroom table one day. So, sorry.
And it was actually about trying to, figure out a narrative that would resonate with the business community. And so I really like that example, even though I lost that battle.
Good example of hearing other perspectives in the room. I'm just looking at the time, and we're just about out of time. There's one more question, and I wonder if you have even just one thought on this question from Nick, is if messages based on fear and shock don't work, why are the messages so often sticky with us?
I think they're sticky. They make an impact, but they don't make an impact on engagement in our experience. So they do make an impact. I would be like, oh my God, I'm horrified. I might share this with someone. This is horrifying. But in our experience anyways, you're much less likely to actually act, because let's face it, we've seen, if we take the issue of poverty or homelessness or addiction, we've been shown some fairly significant issues of that, the person cower, in the doorway, that's frightening, all of this kind of quote unquote issue porn that we see, but we haven't necessarily moved the needle on public engagement on these issues. Obviously, there's a lot of different factors wrapped up in that, but that's just in our experience in the issues that we've tackled, that shock and fear doesn't ultimately convert into engagement. It might convert into attention briefly.
It doesn't last, and I think if you look at history, it teaches us this lesson really clearly. And I'll take a legion of people who are passionate about something, who want to be part of something, over a group of people that are just afraid in the moment any day. And one's going to have longevity, and one is not. And so you might be able to trick people for a short period of time, but if you actually build a tribe of people who believe what you believe, and you try to go after an issue with them, it's going to be more powerful than any fear campaign ever will be. And I think history sort of backs us up on that.
Mm-hmm. The really simple metaphor that I've heard there several times is, you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So, well, thank you. We are in the final minute of the webinar, so I wanted to thank Lindsay and Jeff, both of you again, for being on today's call and talking about engagement and your experience in London and with nonprofit partners and collaborative initiatives around the city. And for everybody who's on the line today, we had over 100 people join us and ask lots of great questions. We had lots of thank yous in the questions box to both of you for helping to answer those questions. If you go to the next slide, I'll just encourage people to stay in touch with us through our www.vibrantcanada.ca website or subscribing to our bi-monthly newsletter. Also, we made a quick mention of this as we were talking, but our Cities Reducing Poverty When Business is Engaged event is coming to Hamilton, April 4th to 6th. We love to see you there. We're going to be talking about how we expand that multi-sectoral poverty reduction roundtable. We had a great summit, the first one in Ottawa in 2015, the second one in Edmonton in 2016, and we're going to continue those conversations, potentially joined by Lindsay and or Jeff. So we'd love to see you there, connect, learn, be inspired with us, and build a movement. So the registration information is there, and I'll send it to you in the follow-up as well. We're also hosting a webinar next Tuesday on the 31st with Mayor Iveson and Mayor Eisenberger and FCM's Brock Carlton, and they're just going to be starting that conversation with us, looking at what's happened in the past 8 months with them in poverty reduction and how they've been moving some of their initiatives forward since the last summit, and then helping us to start that conversation about engaging businesses. So that's really exciting. We'll send you that registration link in the follow-up as well, and we hope to see you there. Thank you everybody for joining us today. If you have any feedback on how we can improve our webinars, please send them to Natasha at tamarackcommunity.ca. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.